Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
Here in the Wesley Theatre, we've been engaging in a service where there has been an element of offering leadership to God for the year that lies ahead of us. And as I look back over my own ministry, I've enjoyed a rich time of engagement with lay leaders at different times in that ministry. Only a couple of weeks ago, I heard of the death of one of the early mentors in my ministry, who was now in his late 90s. And I was asked to write some words, if I could, to be read at the service. And it wasn't a difficult thing to do. I've been minister of 6 different churches, all with different characters, all with different kinds of congregations in different social settings. And in each one of them, there's been something specific about the place of lay leadership. And this evening, here in the Wesley Theatre, we're thinking of those who offer themselves as leaders within this congregation set in the middle of the city. And as we do that, I turn to Paul's first letter in our New Testament, written to the church at Corinth. Now, the Corinthian church was founded by the Apostle Paul probably only at the most 20 years, probably less, following the death and resurrection of Jesus. Some of its words about the resurrection could be argued to be the oldest and the closest to the resurrection that you'll find anywhere, certainly younger than that we find in the Gospels. And they put us into vital contact, if you like, with the ministry of Jesus. This church was a church that Michael Green, in his excellent work on the Corinthian church, said it was a church that was both dynamic and chaotic. Dynamic and chaotic at one and the same time. A church that loved Paul with a passion and yet with exasperation. We can read about the foundation of the church like you can so many of the early epistles by reading the Acts of the Apostles. You turn to the 18th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles if you want to learn more about what it means for this church in its early days. And the 2 letters we have in our New Testament are probably 2 out of 4 letters that were written to the church at Corinth, of which we only have 2. Well, 2 and a bit maybe. There's an argument that a part of another letter is found within the writings. Put simply, Paul visited Corinth on a number of occasions, probably 3, and spent 18 months there, a strategic part of his ministry. So he has a real relationships with this community, a real concern for their direction. And I think it has much to say to us about leadership. Corinth was a Roman colony which had been rebuilt about 46 years before Jesus Christ. It was a Greek port of great importance, situated on a narrow neck of land. And it was not, however, its geography that made it famous. It was not, I suppose, its great thinkers that made it famous. Unfortunately, it was its immorality. The things that were going on within Corinth brought great problems and questions as far as Paul is concerned, but they were well known. And in fact, the term Corinthianize became well used by some people to describe what was not the best of living. One writer on Corinth described this mixed community in this way. These are very strong words. Greedy for power, dedicated to pleasure, and fascinated by rhetoric or knowledge. Gosh, what a compliment to pay to this community at Corinth. So it's in this context that Paul first came to preach the gospel, establish a church, and then encourage the building of a church in that context. He recollects the fact that they were not always ready to receive him and what he had to offer. Paul had to preach in this way, in a way that might be considered simple, very straightforward, because of the immaturity of this early church. He recognized that he and all the other apostles and leaders were only servants of God, nothing more, nothing less. And it's a good starting point when we think about leadership. We live in a very different kind of society today compared to the generations that have gone before. I think it's only fair to say that many leaders gave themselves to the life of the church in past generations, and we honour them as a total and complete part of their lives. The commitment was true and dedicated. Very often it was the absolute priority of their lives. So we build on that kind of basis. But in a society today where leadership of any kind, not just in the church, is under question. Have you noticed, if you've never noticed it, I'm sure you'd at least begin to understand it, the way that adults talk to babies. Now, I have seen people who are intellectual giants. I've seen people who are folks who in their daily lives you would talk about with extreme seriousness. And I've gone to their homes and I've seen them hold their grandchildren. And notice that they talk to their grandchildren in a special kind of way. The language is very simple. Highly educated people find themselves conversing about 3 octaves higher than they would normally talk when they're talking to the child. It may sound ridiculous if you didn't know that this was not in the context of love, if it wasn't in the context of a real relationship. I remember travelling to South Africa on one occasion. Our daughter was with us, and she was on her own without the rest of the family with their first child. She had brought the baby for us to see. And we stayed at a hotel near to the airport for the last 24 hours. And Carol and our daughter wanted a swim. So they went for a swim. And I had 2 hours talking to a baby. And I'm just glad nobody filmed it or nobody recollected it, but it was a really splendid time. And you ask the child questions, you don't get any answers, except you get lovely grins occasionally. Even if people say it's wind, I don't believe it. And it was so lovely to have that conversation. Now, the Corinthians complained because they thought Paul was talking down to them. They thought that Paul was cooing with them when he described those things that are to do with the essential growth of a Christian community. His argument was that he does this in order to connect with them at the point that makes most sense. Each and every church has its origins in mission. And as we turn to the New Testament and we grasp something of what it means to be a living church, we recognize that the first 9 verses, if you like, of 1 Corinthians 3 talks about this church in this way. Very simply, with the complaint of a church that didn't like to be talked down to. And then in verse 9 we read what is really essentially my text. For we are God's co-workers, you are God's field, God's building. It's hard to realize that it's 2 decades since Mel Gibson made a violent and yet in its own way inspiring film called Braveheart. I was close to a family who always spent their holidays in Scotland. And they were on a relatively small Western Isle of Scotland that had a very small cinema. And it was the opening night of Braveheart. And they said, we were the only English people in the cinema. So they picked up some of the justifiable feelings that Scottish people felt as they observed Mel Gibson's marvellous portrayal. It was a favourite film for many young people for a number of years, looking for brave leaders who would stand up against what was unjust and taking matters into their own hands and doing something about it. But when we read the Sermon on the Mount and when we grasp a picture of the ministry of Jesus and the gospel he offers to us, Jesus doesn't leverage off people's anger towards injustice in a way that creates revenge, but offers a new humanity. And this church at Corinth was offered a new way, something that was distinct. And they, as leaders of various kinds, had to demonstrate that life as they expressed it together. There were many things about this church that had to be true. The first is this: a living church cannot survive division. Verse 3 reads, "You're still worldly, since there's jealousy and quarreling among you. Are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere human beings?" A church cannot survive with disunity. It cannot survive against division. It must be together as one. Now, there are some people who enjoy a good fight and like a bit of division, fine. But don't imagine that your New Testament talks in any way other than that living churches need to be together as one. They cannot survive any other way. And the call to a congregation, to those who are offering as leaders, involves a call to common purpose. It's a good Sunday to remind ourselves of that. We remind ourselves of the hope that calls us together as one. We seek to design programs and thinking about the future, such as we've been engaged in through these past few months, and any missional activity as something that we share together. We exercise a leadership that draws new people into the team and recognize how important that is. But being together as one is vital for the growth of that church. In any congregation that we serve, we do this together. We're called to affirm and support those who are part of the wider church. All members of the church are invited to confess Christ before others. We don't complain about what other people think about our part to play. We know we are called to confess Jesus Christ before other people. We see that as essential. However, those who are leaders and elders have a vital part to play, a specific spiritual ministry that is not merely that of confessing Christ as Christians, but raised up to offer themselves as leaders within that community. The two areas that are vital for leaders and elders and those people who have responsibility. Sharing with those in leadership and ministry in the building up of the membership in love and trust. Sharing with each other and building up each other. As Wesley, a long time ago, the younger one that wrote the hymn said, "We bids us build each other up and gathered into one, to our high calling's glorious hope, we hand in hand go on," recognizing the bonds that unite us, nurturing such members with growth in grace. We exercise our ministry in leadership as a group, not merely as individuals. Therefore, our worshiping together is important. What we do together tonight at the heart of our worship as we break bread and pour wine speaks of that unity in the spirit that is ours. It's a tough call to have to acknowledge that people sometimes lose their way and are part and parcel of the kingdom of God. And we recognize how important it is for us to reach out to be part of that one church together. So here in this context of worship, especially in the breaking of bread, we affirm our oneness in Christ. In our leadership, our sense of spirituality needs to be fostered. As the Uniting Church put it so clearly in their guide to elders, it describes this in a spirit of unity. Kenneth Chafin, in a preacher's commentary, offered a very positive take on this matter by suggesting that leaders who are a team unify. If a living church cannot survive division, then leaders who work together can unify that which is so easily broken, that which is so easily divided. It's in such leadership that we gain a real understanding, not only about pastors and ministers, but about lay leadership too. It seems to me that this whole section in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 is an illustration of how dissensions often grow out of the failure to recognize how each individual person has a part within that leadership. There's a fascinating discussion that lies not only in the words that you find here in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, but I suspect in the specific social context of that church, of how Paul and Apollos were very, very different kinds of people who had a very distinct and different kind of leadership, and yet were used as instrument of building up together the one church. Paul uses an agricultural analogy by suggesting the role he played in preaching the gospel was like planting seed. And Apollos' role in building up the church was like watering the plants. Both were essential. And we know it's fine, you can plant all the seeds you like. In an overheated Australia, we know all too well what happens if there's no moisture there. And if there is no feeding of the seeds. Paul is working against competing factions in the life of this church. He sought effectively to counter the impulse to split. That impulse was very, very real. And time again in the history of Christian communities, people have been tempted to do that. But he is calling them to recognize that they are together one people. We are God's co-workers. You are God's field, God's building, together as one people. A personality cult can be seen all too easily in the realm of politics. Please save the preacher from saying the obvious. We see that so plainly before us at this moment in time, in places near and very much far from here. Personalities that rise above what really ought to be the issue, which are policies and the way things are going to be done. And it existed within the life of this early church. And we recognize that, I'll go back to Chafin again, who once said this, the fact of life has affected the church. And denominations started competing all through history with each other. So individuals and groups divide. But a living church cannot ultimately survive division. It has to be that unity of purpose that holds it together. And then moving on and picking up that verse, each of us who serves God is a servant. The division that prevents the church from living most effectively is one that forgets our core purpose, that goes off on a tangent and forgets why it is we are here and what it is that we seek to do to be a community. As one writer put it, we're not only partners with everyone in the life of the church today, but with those who've gone before us and those who will follow us. We have a part to play in the total life of the church, wherever that church is for us, to be part of that growing community that will be part. And all Christian workers and leaders are called to work together. And therefore, there can be really no place for favourites or parties. The spirit of sharing as a serving people prevents division from occurring. The relationship between being servants of God and those who serve in the life of the church are very important. The writer recognizes that people have different responsibilities and functions. There is nothing worse in the life of the church with two people convinced that they have the same functional calling. We are called together, and God equips his people to be the church in any point in time. He says that the planted church in Corinth requires those who will feed it, water it, make it possible to grow. And remember, Paul can write these words because though he was there in some of its early days, though he visited it from time to time, for the vast majority of time he wasn't there. And he knew this church had to grow. And he knew it would only grow as each person, as each leader recognized that they have a responsibility for its growth. We're very reluctant to talk about success in relation to a local community. But for things to be successful in any way, in any shape, it is entirely in the hands of God. Since each leader is doing the work of God, we recognize that he is the one who ultimately appoints us, who ultimately puts us in the place in which we must find our service, and then enables that service to flourish in the fellowship of a united church. Since each leader is doing the work, we recognize that he's the one who ultimately appoints us. So it is that we read in verse 8, the one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they'll each be rewarded according to their own labor. Stephen Dre reminds us that God is mentioned 3 times in verse 9. We're God's co-workers. You are God's field, God's building. 3 times. Recognizing where the priority is for a church that is alive. Thania, who founded the Lash community, suggested that we all carry a deep wound of loneliness and isolation that is often very, very difficult to overcome. And this wound is so much part of our human condition, and I can't help but thinking that it passes over into the community life of the church sometimes. And we have the one thing that can bring healing and purpose to such an individual loneliness that has never come to terms with what my place is in the community, by a fellowship of people together who offer healing, whilst recognizing the limitations and sadness of communities. The community of God's people offers hope to people. Then thirdly, we must build with care. It's interesting that we move from agriculture to, if you like, architecture, to the place of the building, verses 10 to 15, in the passage that immediately follows. Having talked in the field of the farmer, we now go to the drawing board. Because here it talks about, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building upon it. We must build with care. We see the verses that follow, as we looked earlier. Paul has specific guidance for people who would be leaders in the life of the church, particularly at Corinth. And I think those words apply to those of us that would serve God today. He reminds them and us that with the skill and attention to detail, that which an architect might display, he has been given the privilege of planting. However, it's all of God's grace, none of our doing. The most difficult aspect of leadership in the church often centers on the fact we don't all occupy the same function, and the foundation of one is invariably built upon another. In a church I was once ministering, I had somebody who was a very, very gifted dancer, and displayed that in terms of ministry. And I'm not talking about a little bit of liturgical dance that belongs. She was able to do it in a way that was very moving. When I first saw her do it, I knew God hadn't given me that gift. I was absolutely sure it was not my gift, but it was hers. And the reality is, I think that we all know that we're not all called to do the same things. And there's nothing wrong in that. There's nothing lesser about it or more about it, but we build with care, offering to God whatever those gifts are that we can give to him. The only way I understand that is recognizing the variety of gifts. And remember, it's in Corinthians 12 and 14, those marvelous chapters about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, if you like, tempered by the marvelous passage on love that joins them together, that we understand the variety of gifts. Ephesians 4 is also helpful in understanding this truth about this variety of church. And whilst it's true that the church has a variety of builders and different materials, it's only one foundation, one cornerstone, one person upon whom we build, and that is Christ. We cry out to God, as B.J. Hoff put it this way, we cry out to the searching heart, send me with your word. We cry out to the aching heart, send me with your peace. We cry out to the broken heart, send me with your love. However small or wide my world, Lord, let me warm it with the promise that you care. When archaeologists were digging, in the ruins of Nineveh, they came across a library of plaques. Plaques were not simply something that were invented in the Victorian era to put up in churches to recognize particular tasks, or after times of conflict and people remembered people that had been lost. They went back a long time in history. And very often these plaques contained the laws of the realm. And one of the laws read in effect that anyone guilty of neglect would be held responsible for the result of this neglect. The result of this was that if we failed to teach our children to obey, if we failed to teach them to respect the property rights of other people, we really don't have any right to say about those who don't do things if we have never taught them. And that, I think, has something to say to the life of the church too, in our leadership. We have a responsibility in a very different kind of world. If I think of the life of this mission, if 200 years ago in the early days people had gathered together to talk about leadership, it would have been in an era when people would have recognized that if somebody was set apart in the life of the church to be a lay leader in the church, that really meant something. I would guarantee that for many of us here, unless there is a warmth towards the life of the church, it won't be one of those moments that they say, don't they, in Australia, it stops the barbecue. It won't really just say you've become a lay leader in the church. It's very much a pass the sausage moment, I think that is. We're not too interested in what you've got to say. But I still believe it's just as important for people to be set apart, to recognize their role within the life of the community. Something that's important. John Newton, whose words are so familiar to us in hymnody and thinking, wrote about God's presence that makes our leadership, and I can conclude with these words. If the Lord be with us, we have no cause to fear. His eye is upon us, his arm is over us, his ear open to our prayer, his grace sufficient, his promise unchangeable. If we are to offer ourselves tonight at this table, we do so because we know that that is true and will always be true. Let us together build with care. Amen.